Good afternoon. It's time to begin our regular halacha shiur. We're speaking about Shemitah, and specifically, the issues I want to deal with today are two closely related issues. Number one, children, feeding children. And I don't know if you know anything about children, but anyone who has visited in a Jewish household has probably seen these little creatures. They're sort of like us, but they're a lot smaller. You see them running around in Jewish families. They're called children. I know I used to have a lot of them in my house. Don't know what happened to them exactly. They're not around anymore. And when they eat, one of the characteristics of these little creatures, these children, one of the characteristics is when they eat, they make a mess. It's just unbelievable where the food remnants end up after a child has eaten. So we know from last week that you're not allowed to do anything which is going to lead to the ruination, the destruction of Shemitah, fruits and vegetables. Are you allowed to feed children where you know that a lot is going to be destroyed, because that's the way children eat? That's what the first issue we're going to talk about today. Then we're going to turn to a very closely related issue. What about adults? What about grown-ups who eat and don't finish everything on the plate? What about leftovers? What are you supposed to do with leftovers on the plate? And in concept, that's the same as the issue of what you do with peels or parts of the food in the preparation of the food in the kitchen. In the preparation of the food, you have peels and various parts of the food which are not going to be served. In a normal year, they'd just be tossed into the rubbish or compost heap. What are you supposed to do with them during the Shemitah year if they have Kedusha? So those are the issues we want to deal with today. Let me get the sources on the screen. I know how to do this. And then I bring my chat over here. Okay. Now, the source sheet, which we're looking at on the screen, you can activate it on your screens. The text is available if you want to download it through the link on chat. We're going to begin with the issue of children. The Chazon Ish, who we've met many times and therefore does not need another introduction. The Chazon Ish said, "Tzarich limnoa et hayeladim shelo yivazbubu et ha'ochel." You have to prevent children from treating the food with disrespect. That means you have to prevent the children from wasting the food. You have to prevent the children from destroying, damaging, injuring, ruining the food. And if we're talking about a small child, I cannot begin to imagine how that is possible. And therefore, if you're unable, limnoa, to prevent the child from destroying, damaging, injuring some of the food, you just can't feed him. You can't feed her stuff which has Kedusha, the holiness of the Shemitah year. Well, that seems to be the opinion of the Chazon Ish. But if you look further down on the screen, the Derech Emunah also quotes the Chazon Ish. So here we have a different quotation of the Chazon Ish in which he says, "Tzarich limnoa et hayeladim shelo yivazmu et ha'ochel." The reason we have to prevent the children from damaging, injuring the holy fruits of the Shemitah year, mishum chinuch, is because that's part of educating, part of training the child for mitzvahs. Hare Gram have said mutter, as far as indirectly causing the destruction of Shemitah fruits is concerned, that's no problem at all. You're allowed to indirectly cause the destruction by putting, for example, by putting the fruits and vegetables aside until they rot by themselves. That you're allowed to do. And giving the foods to the child, well, you know that over the next few minutes, some of the food is going to be ruined, but that's called indirect causation. As far as Shemitah is concerned, as far as the Kedusha of the food is concerned, there's no problem in feeding children. The problem is chinuch. one of the obligations of the parents is to accustom the children, train the children to doing mitzvahs, and therefore, once the child has reached the age of chinuch, once the child has reached the age where chinuch, accustoming the child, habituating the child to do Torah and mitzvahs comes into play. Once the child is ready for chinuch, then you have to prevent the child from damaging or injuring the food. Brings up the question, at what age a child is ready for chinuch? At what age do we start training a child? We start habituating a child, teaching a child to keep Torah and mitzvahs correctly? The answer to that is easy enough to formulate, might not be easy to apply in practice, but the basic idea is very simple. It depends upon what mitzvah we're talking about. Children mature at different ages, and children mature at different ages with respect to different mitzvahs. Therefore, the question which must be asked in every instance is this particular child at the moment ready to be trained, ready to be taught about this mitzvah? For example, the Gemara says, the Gemara is all written by men and talks about boys, but you can make parallel female examples yourself. When the child is old enough to know how to put on a tallis to dress himself, then once the child is old enough to dress himself, that's the age where the child can be taught to wear tzitzis. Once the child is old enough to know how to be able to hold a lulav in the proper way and shake it in the proper way, that's the age when you can begin training the child. Well, of course, different children will have different ages when it is appropriate to start training them and doing different mitzvahs. And this is for the parents to decide. It's for the parents who know their child. When the child is old enough to eat properly without unduly destroying the food, that's the time when the child should be taught about the kedusha, the holiness of the Shemitah fruits and vegetables, and not destroy them. Correct. Now there's one possible exception here. If we're talking about a child, a baby, where giving the baby food instantly leads to the baby destroying the food. If the destruction of the food is going to be instantaneous, when you give the baby the food, well, a very small baby like that, where it's going to be instantaneous destruction of the food, giving the baby food with Kedusha Shvius is not indirect destruction, but direct destruction, and that's no good. Bottom line, according to the Chazon Ish, it's okay, according to one source, to feed the child Kedusha Shvius, unless the child is very, very young, a baby, who will destroy it upon receiving it. And as the child gets older, the child should be taught about the mitzvah of eating the food with Kedusha without destroying it. According to the other source, Chazon Ish is quoted as saying you can't give children at all the holy fruits of the Shemitah year. Well, I've added this to my very, very long list of great rabbis who are quoted by their disciples as saying different things, contradictory things. Which position is the legitimate position of the Chazon Ish? Flat out prohibition of giving children Kedusha Shvius, or prohibiting only this giving Kedusha Shvius to babies, small babies, and as the child gets older, you teach the child about how to keep the mitzvahs. Which is the true position of the Chazon Ish? I do not know, but the Chazon Ish is quoted both ways, and for this reason, I, in general, am reluctant to rely upon quotes of any great rabbi, unless that great rabbi chose to publish his own opinion. If the rabbi chooses to publish his own opinion, well, now we know definitively what he thinks. But as his opinions are reported by the disciples, we see quite frequently contradictions. I'll give you my favorite example. There's a disagreement among the poskim about whether men should wear their tzitzis dangling outside their garments or hidden underneath their garments. So a disagreement among the poskim on this issue. Someone once asked the Be'er Moshe, the Debretziner Rav Moshe Stern, asked him, isn't it true that tzitzis are a great mitzvah and therefore you should wear them outside the garment so everyone can see them? And the person who asked the Rav this question got a positive answer. Yes, you should wear them outside, and published that opinion in the name of the great rabbi. Subsequently, the great rabbi published his own tshuva on the issue, in which he says there's no reason at all to wear the tzitzis outside of the garment. It's quite proper to wear them underneath the garments. And the only reason I told that guy that he was right was because he was bothering me and I wanted to get rid of him. Well, you see, just because someone quotes the great rabbi as saying something is not necessarily reliable, and therefore I'm reluctant to rely upon these sources, unless, of course, the great rabbi himself publishes his opinion, then we know what he holds. Now, the next source is the Sefer HaShemitah of Rav Tukachinsky. Rav Tukachinsky was the Rosh Yeshiva of Eitz Chaim here in Yerushalayim. He was a close colleague and friend of Rav Kook back in those days. And he says, Yanichu et haperot b'makom shebehema o of yachol lageshet la'ochlam ma'atzma. There's no objection to putting holy fruits of the Shemitah year in front of animals, so the animals will then come and eat by themselves. Eino mechuyav lemono. You're not obligated to stop the animal from eating, because this is indirect causing of destruction of the fruits. It's true that the animal might destroy some of the holy food of the Shemitah year, but this is indirect destruction, and therefore no problem at all. If he holds this regarding animals, all the more so must he have a similar opinion regarding feeding children, if it's true that you're allowed to place the food in front of the animal, in a place where the animal will get it. All the more so is it clear that it's okay to put the food in front of the child, and then the child takes it and eats it. True, the child will probably destroy some of it, but that's called indirect destruction and perfectly okay. The final opinion I want to deal with is the Ridbaz. The Ridbaz was one of the great rabbis of Lita, of Lithuania, in the beginning of the 20th century. He got a job in Chicago as a Rav in Chicago, but the truth is he wasn't very successful in the beginning of the 20th century in Chicago, because there were not very many Torah observant Jews there, and the Jews were not particularly interested in the improvements in kashrus which the Ridbaz wanted to introduce there. He left Chicago, came to Tzfat here in Eretz Israel, and became the Rav of Tzfat in the early 20th century. And being in Tzfat, the Sefer we're about to quote from deals extensively with the special mitzvot of Eretz Israel. He says, "Mutar liten perot shvi'it l'tinok." It is permitted, flat out permitted, to give the Shemitah food to babies, to children. Af al pi sha'tinok yifarer v'yilachlech hanish'ar, even though it's perfectly clear that the child is going to crumble the food and make dirty with it. Kederech hatinok, like all the children do. Yafsid ochel hanishar. It's true that the child is going to destroy some of the food. Have said kolshu gamke nasa, and we're not allowed to destroy ourselves any of the food of the Shemitah year. Makom makom, in any event, you're allowed to give the child, because this is only indirectly causing the destruction of the food, and indirect causation is permitted during the Shemitah year. Lo shayach gamke de cotton ochel nevelis asalas hapos biyadayim. And although it's true that we're not allowed to feed any prohibited food like treif, we're not allowed to feed a child treif food. If a child takes treif food, he finds it somewhere. The example of the Gemara is a child who's playing with an insect, playing with a beetle, a child playing with some insect. Well, if you know anything about children, if they're playing, whatever they're playing with is likely to end up in their mouths. Small children explore everything with their mouths. So here's a small child crawling around, picks up a bug. It's probably going to end up in the child's mouth. And halachically speaking, there's no objection here. You don't have to slap it out of the child's hand because you're not feeding the child prohibited food. The child just picked it up by himself or by herself. But something which is prohibited, you're not allowed to feed, you're not allowed to give to a child. The child picks it up by himself, by herself, that's okay. But you can't feed the child treif. But in this case, when you're giving the child the fruits of the Shemitah year, when you're giving the child the fruits, they are permitted. There's no prohibition there. And it's just that the child who afterwards is going to damage them, injure them, and that's indirect. Okay, bottom line, what we have is the published poskim. The poskim who have published their own opinions have no objections to feeding children holy fruits of the Shemitah year, even though we know full well that this is going to lead to the destruction of some of the fruits or vegetables. Chazon Ish has been reported to have said something which might be understood as basis for a chumrah here, but I personally am reluctant to rely upon these kinds of rumors. Okay, at this point, I want to turn to leftovers on the plate after someone has finished eating. And from what we learn here, we'll be able to draw conclusions also about peels in the kitchen and parts of the food in the kitchen which are separated and no one wants to eat. We begin with the Rambam. Rambam says, "Ha'me'areh kad shel shemen truma." Now, last week we learned that the kedusha of truma is very similar to the kedusha of Shemitah. The laws governing the respectful way in which we must govern truma food is very similar to the laws governing the way we must respectfully treat Shemitah food. So if we learn the halacha about truma, it applies to Shemitah as well. Now here we have a jar of oil, olive oil, sesame oil, I don't know what kind of oil it is. Let's say olive oil, a jar of olive oil, which is truma. Back in those days, Jews would separate trumot and maserot from the food, and they would actually give the truma to the kohanim. Nowadays, we don't do that, and for various reasons, and therefore nowadays we just separate a minimal amount. But back in those days, they separated significant amounts of truma because that is the way the community supported the kohanim. So here we have a jar, a pitcher, a jar of truma oil, and the Kohen is using it, or maybe it's the Mrs. Kohen who's using it in the kitchen. And one should use the oil from the jar, keep pouring it, use it a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, keep pouring a little bit from the oil jar. Every day you pour a little bit more until it no longer produces a solid stream of oil. It's empty, almost empty. It no longer produces a solid stream of oil. Now we've gotten to the point where Yatchil Hashemen Luntof Ma'at Ma'at. Now it's just dripping out. There are only drops left. Now the jar of Truma oil, the holy Truma oil, is only dripping. There's very little left in it. Kevan Shenatfu Shalosh Tipin Zachazeh. Once 3 drops have come out, one after another, once 3 drops have come out, dial, that's enough. Now the jar is considered empty. At what point is the jar considered empty? When 3 drops, no longer a solid stream can come out. There's not enough oil in the jar to produce a solid stream, but you can get 3 more drops out of it. Once 3 drops have come out of it, that's enough. Now the jar is halachically considered empty. True, there's still a film of holy oil in there. There's still you could still scrape out a little bit of oil. Mutar liten bakad zeh shemen chulin. Now the film of remaining oil loses its status. Now you can use this jar for ordinary oil, even though the ordinary oil is going to get mixed up with a little bit of holy oil that was still in it. Empty means no longer a solid stream coming out of the jar, and 3 drops is all you got. Hare shelo natan ela hiniach et hakad ad shenitmatzet. If you turn the jar right side up again, and enough oil collects in the bottom so that you could pour out more drops, well, the oil which collects in the bottom, that is considered truma again. Bottom line, according to the Rambam, and of course, if we had the Beis HaMikdash again today, and if we were providing the livelihood of Kohanim again today, by forking over the truma to them, this would be the halacha. The oil jar is considered empty when it's no longer of any practical use, because all you can get out of it is a few drops, and therefore is halachically considered empty, and any remaining oil loses its kedusha. Based on this idea, the Aruch HaShulchan, whom we've met a number of times, says, Truma, acharei shekvar hishtamshu ba tashmish hara'uila, after any truma food, and it could be the oil, it could be any fruit or vegetable, anything which was given to the Kohen as truma, once the food has been used in its proper way, kagon, for example, hakohen sach al gufo shem shel truma. For example, the Kohen has anointed his skin with truma. That's a legitimate use of truma, like it's a legitimate use of shmita, rubbing on the skin. Once the Kohen has done that, paka kedusha. Kedusha no longer applies. The food has been used in the proper way. You can eat it in the proper way. You can rub it on the skin in the proper way. And once it's been used in its proper way, it no longer has any holiness. Similarly, kli shehaya bar shemen shel truma v'iru mimeno kederech irui. If you have a jar full of holy oil, and you pour out in the normal way, you pour out all the oil, shuv hashiarim havu kenischalelu, the remainder of oil, which is always a little bit of oil left in the jar, nischalel, loses its kedusha and no longer need be treated with respect. Well, here we have an important idea. According to this, if you use shmita, fruits and vegetables, in the ordinary way, the salad has been served, or the food has been served, which has shmita, fruits and vegetables mixed in it, and that gets eaten in the ordinary way, the leftovers on the plate are similar to the leftovers in the jar. Therefore, the Kedusha vanishes. The Kedusha is lifted once the food has been eaten in the ordinary way. Now, Rav Kook wrote Shabbos Haaretz. This is one of the earlier books that Rav Kook wrote, and the entire book is devoted to the laws of Shemitah, and it's a very important book. Well, can you handle a footnote? It's a very important book for some people. As you might or might not know, Rav Kook was a somewhat controversial figure. There were people who did not like Rav Kook. And to this very day, there are people who are not in favor of Rav Kook's writings. And indeed, the more recent edition of Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Shabtai Frankel edition, which is a magnificent edition of the Rambam. Anyone who wants to buy a Mishnah Torah, the Rambam, by far, the best edition available is the Shabtai Frankel edition. One of the many advantages of that edition is a mafteach, an index, which they added to the back of every volume for every halacha in the Rambam. For every halacha in the Rambam, the index in the back tells you everyone who ever spoke about that, anyone who ever wrote anything about that halacha. If you're learning a specific halacha in the Rambam and you want a total list of everyone who ever wrote about it, you've got it in the index of the Shabtai Frankel edition. In my opinion, the volumes are worth the purchase price just for that index alone, aside from all the other great advantages of that edition. There's one great personality missing from the index. Whenever Rav Kook wrote about the Rambam, the Shabtai Frankel edition does not mention Rav Kook's writings, unless the Chazon Ish quotes Rav Kook, quoting the Rambam. Whenever the Chazon Ish quoted Rav Kook analyzing the Rambam, that appears in the Shabtai Frankel edition. But those passages in Rav Kook, which happen not to be mentioned anywhere in the Chazon Ish, are totally omitted. Well, make of it what you will. I'm unhappy with it. Let's see what Rav Kook had to write about the issue at hand. Kederech shemeraktim et hakemach kol hashana. You sift flour. Every year, you always sift the flour. There are two reasons to sift flour. One sifts the flour to get out the insects. It's not such a big problem nowadays, but used to be a big problem. The reason insect infestation in flour used to be a big problem and is no longer a big problem. There are two reasons why the problem is no longer very serious. Reason number one, the modern mills, after milling the flour, after grinding the wheat into flour, pass the flour through what is called a dissection machine, a machine which slices every tiny flake of flour in half. This machine, which slices every tiny flake of flour in half, also will slice in half any insect eggs which happen to be in the flour. Therefore, they will not hatch. And therefore, flour nowadays, it's very rare that flour nowadays becomes infested. Second reason why we have a vanishingly little problem with infested flour here in Eretz Yisrael nowadays is because the Eidah Haredit in Mea Sha'arim, which is the strictest rabbinic hechsher in Israel today, they have the supervision of all the 7 mills in the state of Israel today. Israel is a small country. There are 7 commercial mills which supply all of the flour, commercial flour in this country. and each of the 7 mills is under the supervision of the Eidah Haredit and Mea Sha'arim, and they insist that no flour leave the mill unless it has first been sifted with a filter, with a sieve of 80 holes per inch. Not true, 40 holes per inch, and 40 holes per inch is a fine enough sieve to sift out any insects. Given the section machine and given the sifting which is required by the Eidah Haredis in every one of the commercial mills in Israel today, it is extremely rare to find a packet of flour, whether it's whole wheat or white flour from a commercial mill, extremely rare to find it infested. In those days, flour had to be sifted because of the possibility of infestation. The second reason is, of course, many recipes call for sifting. Many products, particularly baked products, if you bake, sifting aerates the flour, and you end up with a much better product. In any event, the way you sift the flour every year, kach noagim b'shvis, sift the flour during the Shemitah year exactly like you sift the flour any other year. What does that mean? Normally, when you sift the flour, there's a little bit of junk left in the sieve that gets tossed in the rubbish. Similarly, in the Shemitah year, once you have sifted the Shemitah flour in the ordinary way, what's left in the sieve, you just toss in the rubbish, just as you would do in any other year. Anything left in the sieve, you just toss out as you would any other year. And why are you allowed to do that? Because you're sifting the flour as is usually done. The idea is, once you have sifted the flour in the normal way, the psolet, the elements which you don't want to use in your product, get tossed out. They lose kedusha, just like food which is no longer going to be eaten loses its kedusha. Avalim ratzala sot solet menupa harbe achiyotze kavo kabaya minasa lo yashlich. All of this applies in ordinary sifting, but if you're doing an extreme job of sifting because you want only the very finest flour, then what's caught in the sieve you should continue to use. Now, the idea is as follows. As we've learned in the previous sources, the kedusha of fruits and vegetables in the Shemitah year vanishes when the fruits and vegetables have been used in the ordinary way. The leftovers no longer have kedusha. And here we have another example of that in Rav Kook, that once you've sifted the flour in the ordinary way, what's left over loses any kedusha and can just be tossed in the rubbish. Now, Rav Kook, later in his life, published Shelot and Shuvot. So now we're going to quote from a sefer he wrote later in his life, B'inyan hashlachat klipin. As far as throwing peels into the rubbish is concerned. Well, he says like this, Im hem ru'uyim linakotam. If the peels can be cleaned and then they're good to eat, you can clean them and eat them. Lo nim'asu, if there's nothing disgusting about them, but you can clean the peels and they're perfectly edible. Yesh lama, she'ein bo b'shem hefsed, that these peels should be cleaned and either eaten or set aside until they rot by themselves. That's if the peels are not so disgusting that people would refrain from eating them. They could be cleaned, and people would eat them. Ela deyesh lomar she'im hu be'inyan shemi shekvar ra'a otam mu'usim lo yochlam nechmat mi'us. But what about someone who sees the peels before they were cleaned? You peel the carrot, you peel the cucumber, you peel whatever it is, and it's true. You could clean the cucumber peels and make them edible, but at the moment, it's really a mess. At the moment, it's repulsive. At the moment, no one would eat it. Kvar Nikra have said, that's called already having been destroyed. What does that mean? The Gemara talks about the following situation. What about food that one person has chewed and decides not to eat, spits it out? Well, another person's not going to want to eat that food. That's a little bit repulsive. And therefore, of course, it's inappropriate for someone else to eat that food which someone else chewed. That's pretty simple and straightforward. And therefore, if someone has chewed truma food or shmita food and decided you don't want to swallow it, so you spit it out, well, that food has already been destroyed, and therefore can just be tossed into the rubbish. No one should eat that. That's simple and straightforward. But what about a slightly more complicated case? What about a case of someone who puts the holy truma food or the holy shmita food into the mouth just for a moment and decides not to eat it and takes it out of the mouth? It continues to looks fine. By looking at it, no one would know that it was in someone's mouth. Oh, but if anyone saw you put it in your mouth, they wouldn't want to eat it. And the Gemara says, it doesn't matter whether or not anyone saw you or not. If someone would be put off, if someone would be repelled, if they saw you put it in your mouth, that's enough to say that the Kedusha has been destroyed. Just putting it in your mouth, even though it still looks perfectly fine, if someone had seen you put it in your mouth, then they would not want to eat it. They would be repelled by that. Well, it turns out that according to Rav Kook, any food which is left over on the plate and people would not want to eat it because it's left over from someone else's plate, if no one else is going to be wanting to eat it because it's slightly repellent, slightly repulsive, if that's the case, then the Kedusha has vanished and it can just be tossed into the rubbish. Now, this is a very powerful idea and deserves a proof. So I will now bring you a proof that Rav Kook is correct, a proof from the Rambam. Rambam says as follows, Knivat yerek and nimseit begina. The Rambam is talking about cabbage, lettuce, leafy green vegetables. The farmer, the Rambam says gina, but gina was the word the Rambam used for farm. The farmer harvests his cabbage or lettuce, whatever the leafy green vegetable is, and on the farm, before bringing the produce to the market, he removes the outer leaves, which are not good anymore. When he brings it to the market, he's going to want the cabbage to look good, and therefore the outer leaves, which don't look good, they get removed at the farm before the food is brought to market. Well, those leaves which the farmer removes at the farm have no kedusha, and therefore all the laws of kedusha of things that grow from the ground do not apply to them. The farmer removed them. That means they're not edible. And since the farmer decided they're not edible, I'm not going to bring them to the market even, no kedusha at all. Now, v'shel bal habayit, and inside babayit, what about this head of cabbage when it comes into your house? You buy the cabbage or the lettuce, whatever it is in the marketplace, you bring it home, and you're not happy with the outer leaves. And you tear off the outer leaves, and you're not going to eat them. Those outer leaves, chayevet, those outer leaves still have kedusha. So here we have two different halachot. The leaves which are pulled off by the farmer lose their kedusha. The leaves which are torn off at home before you prepare the cabbage for eating, those retain their kedusha. What's the difference? The difference is that the farmer removes only those leaves which are clearly, definitively inedible, and no one is going to want them. In the household, the cook who is preparing the food in the household is a little bit stricter than the farmer. Even the outer leaves, which could be eaten but don't look so nice, in the household, the cook does not want that to be served as part of the salad, but the outer leaves are edible. The idea, therefore, according to the Rambam, is exactly the same as the idea of Rav Kook, and Rambam, therefore, is a perfectly valid source for the idea of Rav Kook. If the food is so repellent that people would not want to eat it, it loses its kedusha. And therefore, leftovers on the plate, which no one is going to want to eat, have lost their kedusha and can be tossed into the rubbish in the ordinary way. Let's go one step further. But the Radbaz he was from the generation of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. He was either a baby or a very young boy when his parents took him out of Spain at the time of the expulsion. He was born in Spain, but then he ended up in Egypt. The family did not go directly to Egypt; they came through Eretz Israel. But he became the Rav of Cairo. He became leading Rav of Egypt in the generation right after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And of course, he has a lot to say about the laws of Eretz Israel, since he lived right next door to Eretz Israel. Hagananim, Ganan in modern Hebrew means a landscaper, a gardener. But in Rabbinic Hebrew, it means a farmer. Like the Gananim, the one who's in charge of the Gina, which in those days meant farm. Farmers, farmers, when they tear off the outer leaves of the cabbage, they throw away only the leaves which are completely useless. They throw out the leaves which no one would eat. Those leaves lose any kedusha, and you can treat them however you want. But the leaves which get thrown out in the home when you're preparing the cabbage for the meal, in the home, people are more strict about what they want to look very nice. Even leaves which could be eaten, they don't want in their salad because it doesn't look nice. And therefore, the leaves which are removed at home retain their kedusha. Well, here we have one more proof that the kedusha of Shemitah fruits and vegetables vanishes at the point in time when the food is repugnant, repellent, and no one is going to be willing to eat it. Could it be eaten? Yes. Is anyone going to be happy to eat it? No. At that point, it loses its kedusha, and you can treat it however you want, toss it in the rubbish, do whatever you want with it. Compost it. Composting, there's no objection to composting during the Shemitah year, but those who do compost, there is a prohibition to use the composted material to fertilize the fields. You just have to leave the compost heap until after the Shemitah year, and then it can be distributed in the fields. Then it can be used as fertilizer, but not during the Shemitah year. Now, everything we've learned so far leads one of the great modern rabbis, namely Rav Shaul Yisraeli. Rav Shaul Yisraeli was also a close friend and colleague of Rav Kook, and he was for many years the Rav of Kfar HaRoeh here in Eretz Yisrael, and he was for many years a member of the Moetzet Rabbanut. He was one of the rabbis in charge of the Rabbanut HaRashit, the chief rabbinate of Israel. And the conclusion he drew from all of these sources is she'ariyot ochel nimtzim b'tzalachat, leftovers on the plate after someone has finished eating, ein bahem kedusha shvius, have no kedusha, and therefore you can treat them as you like, toss them into the rubbish. And here you have on the screen the exact page number in his sefer where he says that. Now, this is only everything we've seen up to this point is a leniency which is supported by many sources, as we have seen. It's a leniency which is supported by the greatest of contemporary rabbanim, as we have seen. And therefore, people who are following this leniency of simply tossing into the rubbish anything left over on people's plates after they finished eating, that person is following this opinion, which is a fit opinion to rely upon. And we surely cannot object to that. As you know, in my shiurim, in my classes, I always endeavor to present both sides of the issue, to present opposing points of view where they exist. So now we're going to turn to the other opinion, different from everything we've learned up till now. The other opinion has to do with the Tosefta. Now, the Tosefta was written by the same rabbis who gave us the Mishnah, and therefore is a very similar weight, a very similar significance. The Tosefta says, Chomer b'shvit she'ein b'maiser sheni. In some areas, the Kedusha of the Shemitah year is stronger than other Kedusha in other food scenarios. Shashvi'it mitzvah yesh, but the reason is that Shvi'it, Shemitah fruits and vegetables, unlike other holy fruits and vegetables, has a special mitzvah that applies to it. It says in the Torah, as we saw last week, La'ochla, the holy fruits of the Shemitah year are La'ochla, to be eaten. It's a mitzvah of the Torah to eat Shemitah fruits and vegetables. Unlike Truma, Maisa, other holy fruits and vegetables, which is no specific mitzvah to eat them. The Kohanim, the Levim are permitted to eat them, but they're not fulfilling any particular mitzvah when they do eat it. Shemitah fruits and vegetables have the additional mitzvah of getting eaten, and therefore the Kedusha in Shemitah is stricter than the Kedusha in other foods. Psolet, ochlin ka'ochlin, and therefore, as far as Shemitah is concerned, leftovers are just as holy as the food itself. Oh, well, Here we have a source in the Tosefta which contradicts everything we've learned up till now. According to the Tosefta, the peels in the kitchen or the leftovers on the plate after someone has finished eating are just as holy as the food was at the beginning. This contradicts everything we've seen. Now, here's another Tosefta. Second Tosefta says, Klipei pulin sumsumim, the shells of nuts and the pods of beans, yesh b'hem ochel, they can be eaten. If they can be eaten, they have kedusha. If they cannot be eaten, they're okay. A walnut shell, no one eats. No kedusha there. Oh, but peas. When I was a boy, my mother would buy peas in the supermarket and bring them home. And it was our job, or the children had the job of opening up every pod and taking out the peas. It's been a long time since I've seen those pods. They still have them. I suppose. I suppose you can still buy peas in the pod in the shuk. I haven't seen them in a while. But though those pods, although they're not in general eaten, can be eaten. They can be cooked up, and you can eat them. If the shell or the pod is edible, it retains kedusha. Klipei melafafonim, the peels of cucumbers, even though there's no cucumber, it's just the peel. You peeled it so precisely that you have only peel with none of the flesh of the cucumber stuck onto the peel. You peeled it so precisely, even though it's only peel. Cucumber peels are edible. I eat them, and therefore they have kedusha. Klipe etrog asurim. The peel of an etrog can be eaten. Indeed, people make jam out of it. Galine etrog mutarim. The stones, the pits in the etrog can be eaten, unlike apple seeds, unlike apple pits, which of course poisonous. Etrog asurim mepneakiot, but the flesh of the etrog is inedible. Why is it inedible? Because only pregnant women would eat the flesh of an etrog. The flesh of an etrog is a special refuah only for pregnant women. Aside from pregnant women, no one would eat the flesh of an etrog. Well, bottom line, the Tosefta, unlike all the other sources we've seen, says the kedusha remains in the peels. The kedusha remains in the leftovers on the plate. And not surprisingly, there are some poskim who are following this stricter. Right, you not eat the whole restaurant. And as I said before, please do not eat the pits of the seeds in the apple. The apple seeds have high concentration of cyanide, as few as 4 seeds can be fatal. People end up hospitalized in very serious condition after eating apple seeds. Usually it's only campers who roast the seeds, and then the seeds split open in the roasting. Then they swallow them. Those are the people who get poisoned and end up in serious condition in the hospital. If you swallow the seed whole, if it's not been cracked open, so the cyanide's not going to leak out, it'll just go through your body and be excreted, and the cyanide will remain in the seed. But you don't want to eat apple seeds which have been cracked open either through roasting or through grinding. Why on earth is all this interesting? According to the Tosefta, and there are rabbis who follow the Tosefta, even leftovers have to be treated with Kedusha. Now this leads to the common practice of the Pach Shel Shemitah. People have a separate place where they put the leftovers, where they put the peels until the peels and leftovers rot, and then they get either composted or thrown into the rubbish. My personal feeling is that since the mitzvah of Shemitah is once only 7 years, my personal practice is to be strict on this matter. Since I have the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah this year, I want to do it in as strict a way as I can. And therefore, in my home, the peels and the leftovers on the plate get put into a special place, set aside until they rot, and only then will they be composted or put into the rubbish. But I know full well that there are many people out there who are not following my strict approach, and instead are following all the poskim we've seen in the first part of today's class. Well, I cannot frown upon them. I cannot rebuke them. I smile upon their practice. I surely have no objection to them following Rav Shaul Yisraeli and the Radbaz and all the sources we saw previously. I surely can smile upon that opinion, and therefore, I need not be concerned about delivering holy fruits and vegetables, delivering holy food to someone who is going to take it home and throw out the leftovers. If they wish to follow the lenient opinion, I surely have no objection to that. And in their home, they will follow the lenient opinion. And therefore, I have no problem in enabling them to follow the lenient opinion because they are not sinning by doing that. The prohibition of lifnei iver lo titen mechshol, the prohibition of putting a stumbling block before the blind, the prohibition of enabling someone to sin applies only if that person is sinning. But if the other person is following a legitimate opinion of the poskim, there's no sin in that, and therefore I am not enabling anyone to sin by helping them follow an opinion which I personally reject, and therefore I'm off the hook as far as lifnei iver is concerned, as far as putting a stumbling block before the blind is concerned, as far as enabling the others to do what they do is concerned. Well, and this is true not only in connection with Shemitah, this is true throughout the length and breadth of Torah, wherever there is a divergence of opinion among the poskim, which means more or less always. I mean, rabbis, it's hard to point to something that rabbis agree upon. Someone who is following the other opinion, other than the opinion I follow, well, there's no objection to that, and I can even enable them to do so. So these are the basic points which I wish to cover today. Now I'm open for questions. Do you have any questions you wish to ask at this point? Everything is perfectly clear. Yes.
My question would be, wouldn't it be easier, especially in religious area, to have waste container for Shemitah leftovers? Instead of keeping it in the house till it is rotten, just to bring it out and to leave it outside on the street to get rotten, because the apartments are very small. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to keep it inside.
Yes. Well,
practical.
Well, that is an excellent suggestion. And it just needs someone to organize it. If someone would organize it, it would get done. But of course, I'm too lazy to do that. Well, we have to find some young person who's energetic and willing to take upon himself or herself the responsibility.
Yes.
But Batya, do you live in Yerushalayim, Batya?
Yes.
And can I ask you where
But
you
I
are
get
originally
cooked
from?
food. I don't have. I'm sure I don't get Shemitah food. I get cooked food from our organization.
Wonderful, wonderful. Can I ask you where you come from? Where do you come from originally?
Germany.
From Germany.
And I'm going back to Germany now.
Uh-huh.
In the next 2-3 months.
Irre ich mich oder sprechen Sie auch Deutsch?
Ich spreche auch Deutsch.
Ja, also
Woher
woher kommen Sie in Deutschland?
Oh, there are other people now. We can have it.
Oh, okay.
Just,
another time.
Just have it in my mind. It's easier when there is, especially in Meir Sherim, when there's a place to bring the Shemitah, or like to go to Genitza, to bring the books there.
Exactly.
Something like this.
Exactly.
Okay, someone younger than
Excellent. Me. Excellent idea.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have other issues? Yes, Miriam.
So hi, so I live in a place called Telstone and we have Shemitah Pachs. Mm-hmm. But personally, I don't know how to use it because let's say today is Wednesday, right? And I throw my Shemitah Pach in there today. And then somebody else throws their Shemitah Pach in there tomorrow and somebody the next day. So my Shemitah is going to rot before somebody who throws their Shemitah in there on Friday. So how does all that work out? And if you could clarify that, I'd be happy to use the Shemitah Pach as opposed to having little Pachim on my window, one for Sunday, one for Monday, one for Tuesday, one for Wednesday, one for Thursday, and then
Yeah. Well. Here, Batya's idea is apparently actually working in Telstone. Someone actually organized it, and since I know that the rabbis of Telstone are very well organized, I'm absolutely sure that the whole thing is under the supervision of the Rav of Telstone, and I'm sure these issues have been taken care of. Exactly what the procedures are, I do not know, but I'm totally confident that it's correct. And if I were there, or when I visit my family, which lives in Telstone, I would use those pachim. Okay.
I have a friend in Telstone. I'm going to ask him. So I'll give you the answer next week.
Very good.
What a shame.
Okay, Jody, did you want to say something?
No, all good.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so let us pause at this point. I wish you a good week and eventually a good Shabbos, and look forward to seeing you all again next week. Until then, shalom, shalom.